I guess I was probably not much more than 6 or 7 years old, and my mother decided that we were going to drive down to what's now a fairly civilized place at Flamingo in Everglades National Park and see how far we could go on the dirt road. There was no park facility at Flamingo. When you got to Flamingo, all it was some staked out docks with some nets hanging on them. And the road itself was one of those absolutely marvelous, horrible, terrible roads in a very beautiful place. It was gray, greasy marl, and if you weren't very careful, you got stuck. And so we got stuck and we pushed out. We got stuck, we got pushed out, and we saw all sorts of interesting creatures as it got dark, and I think we probably didn't get home till 10 o'clock at night. But 4 little children in the back of the Jeep going down a dirt road that you didn't know where it went to and you didn't know what you were going to find was quite wonderful. The mosquitoes were quite awful. The Everglades is South Florida. Heart, soul, it is the whole water system that makes the coast exist, that makes the Keys exist. It goes from north of Orlando in terms of its connectedness, in terms of the greater Everglades ecosystem, all the way down through Florida Bay and through the bridges and the Keys and out to the reef. And it does something in managing the water that we've never learned how to do as people, that worked much better when we started. But we thought there was too much water. And so the first decades of settlement in Florida were all about getting rid of the water. And the magic of the Everglades, the magic of what Marjorie called the River of Grass, actually starts well above it in the Kissimmee Valley, where you don't have the wide sawgrass marsh, but you've got a winding river that winds 100 miles before they turned it into a ditch that went just 50 miles. It's that moving slowly, evaporating as you move slowly, spreading out into a floodplain where when it floods, you simply cover a much wider area. When you have too much water, you evaporate more water. And you recirculate it upstream again into the clouds. When you have too little water, you lose less water because it goes back into the stream and back into, as you go further south, Shark Valley Slough. So the ability to damp the extremes of flood and drought, the ability to clean up water, the ability to provide a productive enough environment that you've got some of the most fantastic bird life in the world, but to balance your productivity and nutrients so they are where they should be, when they should be, for the critters, the larvae, the very base of the food chain that needs them. For people who thought they were civilized as they moved into South Florida, the first and most important thing in everybody's mind, and probably best exemplified by Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, an early governor of Florida back in the early 1900s, was drain the swamps. And draining the swamps was about getting rid of malaria. Draining swamps was about exposing south of Lake Okeechobee this fantastic black muck to grow things on. Draining the swamps was to keep you from getting flooded out when we had a hurricane and we had a heavy rainy year. So they dug canals as fast as they could dig canals, and the more civilized we got and the bigger the cranes we got, the more canals we built. So our first right on up probably until before World War II was draining the swamp. The consequences of draining the swamp in the Everglades were first noticed in Miami when the well fields started going salt. You had a huge head of fresh water back west of Miami, and you had well fields that were fairly close to the saltwater ocean. When you dried up the swamp in the wet season because you didn't want all that water, then you got a really dry swamp in the dry season. And that caused the salt water to come into the well field, so that in 1945 they had to start building salt dams in all the canals they had dug in order to drain the swamp. So they would put in dams that held the water back to a level of at least maybe 2 or 3 feet above sea level, and that way reduce the salt intrusion that was happening with the wells. In terms of what we did to the Everglades, physically, it was the edges. And particularly from Miami right on up through Broward and Palm Beach County, we drained those edges, we canalized them, we filled areas, and we covered them with so much pavement and subdivisions that they are irreclaimable. The next thing that happened to civilization, where we noticed that we hadn't really meant to do that to ourselves, was when the fires started. And I could remember in the 50s and 60s when whole swaths of the Everglades west of Miami were on fire. And we had dried it out so much that in a dry year, the peat started burning, and it just kept burning. And there was no way you could put it out. And if the west wind blew into Miami, everybody was coughing. Kids were in the hospital emergency room with asthma. We knew that was not a good idea. When we got to the point where we were burning the Everglades, we knew we'd made a mistake. We didn't quite know what to do with it, but we knew we'd made a mistake. Our knowledge that we are going to destroy South Florida if we don't recreate as best we can the natural system that gives us clean water, that gives us the right patterns of rainfall, that damps our floods and reduces them and reduces the extremities of our drought. If we don't do that, it's not just about the critters. It's not just about the place. It's about Miami's water supply. It's about whether Biscayne Bay is going to be a toxic algae bloom. It's about the effects on the reef. It's about the two coastal estuaries and whether you're going to destroy them. It's about whether Lake Okeechobee is going to become a cesspool that's covered with a 90% cover of toxic algae. Those things are so totally damaging that if we allow them to get worse and we don't do some fairly dramatic things to make them better, which is what Everglades restoration is about, then it is going to not just be uncomfortable like the fires of the 1960s, it's going to be untenable. The key, oddly enough, ironically enough, the whole piece of the puzzle that makes Everglades restoration work is connecting the River of Grass from Lake Okeechobee to the south. And it has become the war cry, the motto for Lee County and Fort Myers, for people around the estuary in Stewart, for people around Florida Bay and in the Florida Keys, for those who care about Everglades National Park, and for those who care about Miami's water supply. Sending clean water south is not about destroying the sugar industry or making people stop farming south of the lake or taking away the jobs of people who are working in the sugar fields. Sending the water south is peaceful coexistence. It is a plan to connect what we're doing in the Kissimmee, what we're doing around the lake, what we're doing on the two coastal canals, to connect that to a flow down to the south that makes Everglades National Park sustainable.
After all these years and all that you've gone through, what keeps you going?
Paddling out into the back creeks there, watching sunrises and sunsets, climbing mountains, whitewater kayaking. I get high on wild, beautiful places, all kinds of wild, beautiful places. The week after I was convicted, Jim took all our frequent flyer miles and we went down to Patagonia. I've seen penguins and ostriches and guanacos and the most beautiful mountains off of the Andes. Pieces of the natural world that I've fallen in love with are diverse and worldwide and never cease to just, give you the joy that you get when you see a white-tailed deer leaping. So I feel like I owe it to it.